My name is Margaret. I'm 28 years old, and after a 12-hour shift at the hospital, where I'm a registered nurse, the sensible thing to do would have been to go straight to my apartment. But instead, I found myself driving to my parents' house for our traditional weekly family dinner. I was exhausted. My scrubs still smelled of disinfectant, and every muscle in my body ached. But I kept showing up every week, hoping that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they would see me the way they saw my older brother, Bruce. Looking back now, I realized that night would be the last family dinner I would ever attend. What happened changed everything, and what I said in response left them completely silent. Before I tell you what happened that night, leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from. And please hit the like button and subscribe for more real stories. Trust me, you won't believe what I did next. I was born into a middle-class family, like many others, in Ohio. My father, Frank, now 62, spent his entire career working at the local auto plant. My mother, Patricia, 59, worked as a secretary at a downtown law firm. On paper, we were the perfect American family. But the reality was much more complicated. My older brother, Bruce, at 31, was everything my parents ever wanted in a son. He graduated with honors from engineering school, landed a well-paying job at a tech company, married his college sweetheart, Sandra, and they were already planning a second child. Bruce was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. He was their pride, the family success story, proof that they had done something right as parents. And then there was me. From the moment I could understand, I knew I was different. Not objectively, but different in the way my parents saw me. When Bruce brought home straight A's, they celebrated with his favorite dinner and bragging phone calls to relatives. When I brought home straight A's, they just nodded and asked why I couldn't be more like Bruce in other ways too. The pattern started early and never stopped. When I turned 16, my parents simply forgot my birthday. They were busy helping Bruce prepare for a football scholarship interview. I spent that day alone in my room, hoping someone would remember. No one did. But 2 weeks later, when Bruce scored the winning touchdown in the homecoming game, they threw him a surprise party that lasted until midnight. My high school graduation fell on the same day as one of Bruce's college football games, 3 hours away. My parents opted to go to his game instead of watching me walk across the stage. I was in the audience, searching for their faces, but all I found were empty seats where they should have been. They explained that Bruce's game was more important because it could lead to professional opportunities. When I graduated from nursing school with honors, they actually attended the ceremony, but throughout the event, they complained loudly about Bruce being unable to attend due to a work conference. During the graduation dinner, they spent 45 minutes on speakerphone with Bruce, discussing his latest promotion, while my diploma sat forgotten on the table. Despite all this, I never stopped trying. Calling them every Sunday morning was a tradition for me. I attended every family gathering, even when I had to swap shifts at the hospital. I remembered their birthdays, their wedding anniversaries, and every holiday, always with carefully selected gifts. I helped set up the new television, taught my mother how to use her cell phone, and explained my father's medication after a minor cardiac episode he had 2 years ago. I truly loved my job in the emergency room. There's something powerful about being there for someone at their lowest point and helping them through it. I've held the hands of frightened children, comforted grieving families, and celebrated with patients who recovered against all odds. My colleagues respected me. My supervisor nominated me for a leadership program. I was recently recognized for saving a man's life during a particularly difficult cardiac arrest. But none of that seemed to matter when I walked through my parents' door every week. In their eyes, I was still the disappointment, the daughter who chose a safe career over something ambitious like Bruce. They saw my nursing degree as a form of conformity. Even though I'd found genuine purpose in healing others, that Tuesday night started like any other family dinner. I'd just finished a particularly grueling shift in the emergency room. We'd treated 2 car accident victims, an elderly woman with pneumonia, and a teenager who'd poisoned himself with his mother's prescription medication. I was emotionally drained and physically exhausted, but I stopped at the grocery store before heading to my parents' house anyway. I picked up a bottle of their favorite wine, fresh flowers for the dining room table, and a chocolate cake from the bakery section. It was the same routine I'd followed for years, always arriving with something to contribute, always hoping that somehow it would bring me the warmth they showed Bruce. As I pulled into the driveway of the 2-story house where I grew up, I noticed Bruce's silver SUV and Sandra's white sedan already parked there. A familiar feeling of anxiety tightened my stomach. Family dinners were always harder when Bruce and Sandra were present, because it meant I'd spend the evening watching my parents heap praise on them, barely acknowledging my presence. I walked down the familiar brick path, past the rose bushes my mother tended so lovingly, and knocked on the front door. My father opened it with a neutral expression, which immediately transformed into a genuine smile when he saw the bottle of wine in my hand. "Oh, good, you brought wine," he said, taking the bottle without looking at me. Bruce was telling us about his promotion opportunity. That was it. No questions about how work went or if I was tired. Just an appreciation for the wine and an immediate shift in focus to Bruce's accomplishments. I followed him into the living room, where my mother was arranging appetizers on the coffee table, while Bruce and Sandra were comfortably seated on the couch, looking relaxed and happy. "Hey guys," I said, placing the flowers on the side table and setting the cake box on the kitchen counter. "Margaret," my mother said, without looking up from the cheese board. "You're late?" I glanced at my watch. I was exactly 3 minutes past the agreed-upon time. But Bruce and Sandra had clearly arrived earlier, and in my mother's mind, that made me late. "Sorry, I stopped to get dessert," I explained, but she had already turned her attention to Bruce, asking about his latest project at work. I sat in the armchair across from the sofa, the same spot I've occupied at every family gathering for the past 10 years. It's slightly outside the main conversation circle, which seemed appropriate, given my role in this family. Bruce began a detailed explanation of his new position, overseeing a team of junior engineers. His company was developing software for electric vehicle batteries, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who knew his audience was hanging on every word. My parents leaned forward, asking thoughtful questions and making impressed comments. "The pay raise is substantial," Bruce said, flashing Sandra a proud smile. "We're looking at houses in Riverside. Estates now." "Oh, this is wonderful," my mother exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "They're beautiful houses. Remember when we drove by there last Christmas, Frank? I told you those were the houses where successful people live." My father waved enthusiastically. "You've really made something of yourself, son. We're so proud of you." The conversation continued in this vein for about 20 minutes. Sandra shared updates about their attempts to conceive their second child. My parents responded enthusiastically and offered to help with whatever was needed. They discussed vacation plans, home renovations, and Bruce's potential for further advancement within his company. I repeatedly tried to join the conversation. When they mentioned electric vehicles, I mentioned the training I'd recently completed to treat electrical burn injuries, thinking it might be relevant, but no one responded. When they discussed the challenges of pregnancy, I offered to share some resources on prenatal nutrition I'd learned from working with expectant mothers in the emergency room. My mother waved me away, saying Sandra's doctor would sort it all out. Finally, as we headed to the dining room, I decided to share something important that had happened at work. The previous week, I was part of the team that saved a 55-year-old man who had a massive heart attack in our waiting room. It was a tense 40 minutes, but we managed to stabilize him and get him into surgery. He sent a thank you card to our department, specifically mentioning my quick recognition of the signs of his deteriorating condition. "That must have been terrifying for his family," Sandra commented politely. I could tell she was just being nice. "Yes," I agreed. "But it's moments like these that remind me why I love being a nurse. When you literally save someone's life, it makes every hard day worth it." "How beautiful, dear," my mother said in the same tone she would use to recognize a child's finger drawing. "Bruce, tell me, More about this training program your company is sending you to California for. And so, my moment ended. The conversation returned to Bruce's opportunities, Bruce's success, Bruce's bright future. I sat there, eating my mother's roast beef, feeling invisible in my own family. As dinner progressed, the family dynamics became even more evident. My mother prepared all of Bruce's favorite dishes: roast beef with her special gravy, extra butter mashed potatoes, green bean casserole with crispy onions on top, and fresh rolls she'd started making at 5 a.m. She didn't ask what I'd like, and instead added Brussels sprouts, which she knew I didn't like, but Bruce loved. The conversation continued to revolve around Bruce and Sandra's life plans. They discussed their timeline for having children, their ideas for renovating their home before moving, and Sandra's plan to reduce her work hours once they had their second baby. "How clever you two are, planning everything so carefully," my father said, cutting into another piece of roast. "That's what successful couples do. They make strategic decisions. Unlike some people who just go through life without any real goals," my mother added. And although she didn't look at me, the implication was clear. I felt my jaw tighten. "I have goals," she said calmly. "In fact, I'm being considered for a head nurse position, which would mean leading an entire shift in the emergency room." "That's great," my father said dismissively. "But it's not exactly a career with much room for advancement, is it? I mean, you'd still just be a nurse." The phrase "just a nurse" hit me like a physical blow. I spent 4 years in college, passed a rigorous licensing exam, and worked in one of the most demanding departments in healthcare. I saved lives, comforted families in their darkest hours, and continued my education with specialized certifications. But to my father, I was just a nurse. "Nursing is a respected profession," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We are an essential part of the healthcare system." "Sure, honey," my mother said in that condescending tone. "It's a good job for women who want something stable, but Bruce is building something bigger. He'll be managing entire teams, making decisions that affect thousands of people." Sandra, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke. "Actually, Margaret, maybe you should consider going back to school. You could become a registered nurse or even a doctor. You're smart enough." Her words were meant to encourage, but they hurt me, because they implied that what I was doing now wasn't enough. Everyone at that table believed my current life and career were somehow insufficient, that I needed to become something else to be valuable. "I love being an on-call nurse," she said firmly. "I enjoy caring for patients directly. Not everyone needs to be in a management position or have an advanced degree to make a difference." "But don't you want more for yourself?" Bruce asked. And for the first time, he sounded genuinely concerned, not dismissive. "I mean, you're capable of so much more than just emptying chamber pots and giving injections." The way he described my work was so reductive and insulting that I felt my face heat up with anger. "That's not what nursing is," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I perform complex assessments, manage life support equipment, administer medications that require precise calculations, and make split-second decisions that can mean the difference between life and death." Okay, my dad said, raising his hands. "Let's try not to get emotional about this. We're just saying that maybe you should aim higher, like Bruce." My mother added, "He was always ambitious. Even in high school, he had plans. Remember how he mapped out his entire college and career path by his sophomore year? And there they were again, reminiscing about Bruce's early signs of success, his leadership qualities, his natural ability to excel in everything he did. I stood there, listening to them rewrite history, making Bruce seem like a child prodigy, when the truth was much more common. What they conveniently forgot was that I had plans too. I'd known I wanted to be a nurse since I was 12, after spending a week in the hospital with pneumonia. The nurses who cared for me were kind, competent, and reassuring during that frightening time. It was then that I decided I wanted to be that source of comfort to others. I volunteered at the hospital throughout high school, maintained a high grade point average, and worked part-time jobs to save money for college. I was accepted into 3 different nursing programs and chose the one with the best clinical training opportunities. I graduated magna cum laude and passed the licensing exam on the first try. But none of that counted as having a plan in my parents' eyes. The thing is, my father continued, apparently excited by his topic, Bruce has always thought strategically about his future. He chose engineering because he knew it would be lucrative and stable. He chose a company with growth potential. He married Sandra because she comes from a good family and shares the same values. I looked at Sandra, wondering how she felt about being described as a strategic choice rather than a love story. But she seemed pleased with the compliment. And now they're planning to expand their family at just the right time, my mother added. They've established their careers, bought a house, built up savings, all in the right order. The implication was clear. Unlike me, who at 28 was still single, renting and working in a job they considered beneath my potential, it never mattered that I was financially independent, happy with my career choice, and had deliberately focused on honing my professional skills before committing to a relationship. Some people, my mother continued, just don't seem to have that kind of vision for the future. The breaking point came when the conversation turned to the family's future responsibilities. Sandra had just finished describing the house hunting process when Bruce made a casual comment that changed everything. You know, maybe it's time we started thinking about long-term plans for you two too, Bruce said, gesturing toward our parents. I mean, you're both in your 60s. At some point you might need help with some things. My mother smiled fondly at him. Ah, Bruce. Always thinking about the future. That's why we're so grateful to have you. Well, someone has to be responsible, my father said, casting a meaningful look in my direction. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What did you mean by that? I asked. But Bruce has his life together, my mother explained. He has a stable career, a good marriage, financial security. If anything happens to us, we know we can count on him. While some people, my father added, are still trying to figure out their lives in their late 30s. The unfairness of this assessment hit me like a slap. I was the one with medical training. I was the one who lived closest to them. I was the person who had helped my father understand his medications, who taught my mother how to monitor her blood pressure, who advocated for them during their many doctor visits over the years. I'm a registered nurse, I said, my voice tight with suppressed anger. I probably know more about health and aging than anyone at this table. If they needed care, I would be the logical choice to coordinate it. But you work such crazy hours, Sandra pointed out. How would you have time to take care of anyone else? And you're not married, my mother added. You don't have the stability that comes with a solid partnership like Bruce and Sandra's. Marriage doesn't automatically make someone more capable of caring for another person, I replied. And my schedule is flexible. I could arrange my shifts around whatever care needs you had. My father laughed, but it wasn't a gentle laugh. Margaret, you can barely manage your own life. You're still renting that tiny apartment, have no significant savings, and have never had a serious relationship. Each word was like a knife. The apartment I rented was small, but it was in a safe neighborhood near the hospital, and I had decorated it with pieces I loved. I had savings. They just weren't as substantial as Bruce's, because nurses don't earn engineering salaries. And my relationship history was my business, not a measure of my worth as a person. You know what your problem is? My mother said, her voice carrying a definitive tone, making everyone at the table pay attention. You never learned to think beyond yourself. Bruce understands family responsibility. He makes decisions based on what's best for everyone, not just what he wants at the moment. That's not fair, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I've been thinking about this family for years. I'm the one who calls you every week. I'm the one who shows up at every dinner, holiday, and family event. I'm the one who helped Dad understand the insurance when he was confused about the changes at work. These are just small things, my father dismissed. We're talking about real responsibility, long-term planning, the kind of thinking that requires maturity. I stared at him in disbelief. Little things? When you had chest pains last year, who took you to the emergency room at 2 a.m.? When Mom fell and hurt her wrist, who stayed with her for 6 hours until you got back from fishing? Anyone would do that, my mother said, waving her hand. We're talking about more important matters. Bruce understands what it means to be trustworthy. Besides, Sandra added, apparently feeling more comfortable with her criticism, Bruce has always been emotionally present for you. He calls to check on you. He visits regularly. He includes you in his life decisions. Margaret tends to be more distant. I felt like I was living in a parallel reality. I was the one who called every Sunday. I was the one who showed up for dinner even when I was exhausted from work. I was the one who remembered their preferences, their doctor's appointments, their concerns. But somehow, in their minds, Bruce was the attentive son, and I was the distant one. I think Margaret was always a bit selfish. My mother continued, as if I weren't there. Even as a child, she was more focused on her own interests than the needs of her family. That's not true, I protested, but my voice sounded weak, even to myself. Remember when she wanted to go to that summer camp instead of helping Grandma move? My dad asked. Or when she chose to work at Bruce's graduation party. I remembered those incidents very differently. The summer camp was a program for students interested in healthcare careers, and I had saved my own money to pay for it. But they wanted me to help pack my grandmother's house that same week. I offered to help before or after camp, but they insisted it had to be that specific week. As for Bruce's graduation party, I was scheduled to work a double shift at the hospital where I had started as a new nurse. I tried to swap with someone, but it was my first month on the job, and I couldn't find a replacement. I explained this to my parents, but they acted as if I had chosen work over family out of spite. You know, my mother said, as if these examples proved her point, Margaret always put herself first. Bruce would have found a way to be there for the family. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with my parents and Sandra listing all the ways Bruce was superior to me, all the evidence of my lack of commitment to family and selfishness. With each criticism, I felt smaller and more invisible. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Do you realize what you're doing right now? I asked, my voice rising. You're sitting here talking about me as if I weren't even there. You're criticizing everything about my life and my choices, and you're doing it right in front of me. We're trying to help you understand why you need to make some changes, my father said firmly. Sometimes people need to hear difficult truths. These aren't hard truths, I countered. They're unfair characterizations based on your preference for Bruce over me. The words hung in the air for a moment, and I saw my parents exchange a look. Then my mother's face fell. That's exactly what we're talking about, she said coldly. Always playing the victim. Always making everything about you. I'm not playing the victim, she said desperately. I'm pointing out that you treat Bruce and me completely differently, and you've done so since we were kids. Maybe, my father said slowly. That's because Bruce gave us more to be proud of. The final explosion came so suddenly that it caught everyone by surprise, even me. One moment, we were having what my parents probably thought was a constructive conversation about my life choices, and the next, everything fell apart. You know what? I said, rising from my chair so abruptly that it scraped against the hardwood floor. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of coming here every week just to be criticized and compared to Bruce. I'm tired of pretending this is normal family behavior. Sit down, Margaret, my father commanded, in the same tone he used when I was 7. You're being dramatic. No, I'm not being dramatic, I said, my voice shaking. But I continued. I'm being honest for the first time in years. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up knowing that nothing you do will ever be good enough? Do you know what it's like to see the happy expressions on your parents' faces when your sibling walks into the room, knowing you've never seen that same expression directed at yourself? That's not true, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. It's true, and you know it, I continued. When I graduated from nursing school, you spent the celebratory dinner talking to Bruce on the phone about his job. When I got my first promotion, you barely paid it any mind. When I bought my first car with the money I saved, you criticized me for not buying a more practical model. We've always supported your choices, my father insisted, but his tone was defensive now. You supported me, I asked, anger rising inside me. You spent the last hour explaining why every choice I made was wrong. You said my career wasn't ambitious enough. My living situation wasn't stable enough. My relationship status wasn't committed enough. What exactly did you support? Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly wishing she could disappear. Bruce looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Margaret, you're exaggerating, my mother said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Really? Because now you're dismissing my feelings the same way you've dismissed everything. I am for the past 28 years. I began pacing back and forth behind the chair, the words pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. You want to know what I do for work? I said. I save lives, literally. Last week I helped resuscitate a man who had been dead for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. His heart stopped, and we brought him back. His wife hugged me, cried, and said I was an angel. My voice cracked a little, but I continued. I've held the hands of dying patients so they wouldn't be alone. I've taught new mothers how to breastfeed. I've comforted children afraid of injections. I've worked 16-hour shifts during flu outbreaks and stayed late to ensure confused elderly patients understood discharge instructions. We know you work hard, my mother said, her tone lower, but you don't think it matters. You think I'm just a nurse who should aim for something bigger. You think my job is just emptying chamber pots and giving shots. You have no idea what I actually do, and you never bothered to learn. My father coughs, trying to regain his composure. Margaret, we appreciate you helping people, but it's not as impressive as Bruce's work. Nothing I do is as impressive as what Bruce does. I could cure cancer, and you'd probably wonder why I didn't also solve world hunger while I was at it. That's enough, my father said sharply. You're being disrespectful. Disrespectful? I'm being honest. There's a difference. The room fell silent, except for the sound of my heavy breathing. Everyone looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. In their minds, I was having an irrational outburst. In my mind, I was finally telling the truth, after years of swallowing pain and disappointment. You know what the saddest part is? I continued, my voice quieter now, but still intense. I kept coming back here, hoping that someday you would see me, really see me, not as the daughter who isn't Bruce, but as Margaret, as someone with value in her own right. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but whether they were tears of guilt or frustration, I couldn't tell. I thought that if I tried hard enough, if I succeeded in my own way, if I was helpful enough, present enough, and loving enough, eventually you would realize that I deserve to be loved too. We love you, my mother whispered. No, you don't, I replied firmly. You love the idea of having a daughter, but you don't really love me. You love Bruce. You're proud of Bruce. You enjoy Bruce's company. I'm just the obligation you fulfill every week when I show up for dinner. The truth of those words hit everyone at the table like a physical force. Sandra looked shaken. Bruce looked guilty. My parents were shocked, as if they had never considered their behavior could be viewed this way. That's when my father made the mistake that changed everything. You know something, Margaret, he said, his voice rising with anger. Maybe we'd be more proud of you if you gave us more to be proud of. Maybe, if you stopped feeling pitiful and actually achieved something meaningful, we'd have a different relationship. Frank, my mother warned, but he was starting to get excited. I'm tired of tiptoeing around your feelings. Bruce doesn't need constant validation because he's secure in his accomplishments. He doesn't blame us for his problems because he takes responsibility for his own life. Each word was like a hammer blow, but I stood there and endured it, feeling something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. "You want to know the truth?" my father continued, apparently interpreting my silence as submission. "Sometimes I wish you had never been born." The words fell like a physical slap in the air. My mother sighed. Sandra's hand immediately went to her mouth. Bruce said, "Father, no." But my father wasn't finished. "We wish you had never been born. Life would be so much simpler without all your drama and constant need for attention." My mother, instead of contradicting him, nodded slowly. "Maybe this is harsh, but sometimes, yes, sometimes I wish things were different." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The grandfather clock in the hallway rattled, ticking away the seconds as 28 years of hope died within me. And then something remarkable happened. Instead of breaking down, instead of crying, instead of begging them to take back their words, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The disguise was finally over. The truth was finally out. They'd said what they truly felt, and now I was free to respond accordingly. I squared my shoulders, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked directly at my parents. "Perfect," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Then you won't need me when you're old." The effect of my words was immediate and electric. My father's face went from angry red to pale white in 3 seconds. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sandra gripped Bruce's arm so tightly that he twitched. "Maggie, wait," Bruce said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. "Daddy didn't mean it like that. He was mad." "Oh, he meant it," I replied, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "And you know what? He's absolutely right. Life would be simpler. Simpler for you guys to call Bruce when you need a ride to doctor's appointments. It's easier for you to ask Sandra to help with the groceries when you can no longer drive. It's easier for you to manage your medications without a registered nurse in the family." I walked slowly around the table, speaking directly to each of them. It's easier to find someone else to explain insurance paperwork when you're confused. It's easier to find someone else to be with you during medical procedures when you're scared. It's easier to call someone else at 2 a.m. when you think you're having a heart attack. "Margaret, stop," my mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Now you're being vindictive." "I'm being honest, just like you were honest when you said you wished I had never been born." I looked straight at her. "Remember when you had that kidney stone last year? You called me crying because the pain was so bad you couldn't think straight. I rushed you to the emergency room and stayed with you for 8 hours until they got the pain under control." She nodded, unable to speak. "I held your hand while they inserted the needle. I explained each procedure to you in terms you could understand. I fought for you with the medical team when they wanted to release you too early. I brought you home and stayed all night to make sure you were okay." "Yes, you did," she whispered. "And all the while, I kept thinking how happy I was to be there for you. How grateful I was that my medical knowledge could help someone I loved feel less scared and more informed." I stopped, letting those words sink in. "But from what you just said, you wish that person had never been born." My father tried to intervene. "Margaret, you're going too far." "Am I?" "Because I'm just following your logic to its natural conclusion." I turned completely to him. "Remember 6 months ago when you were worried about those chest pains? You didn't want to bother Bruce because he was busy with the promotion. So you called me. I came over, took your vitals, asked detailed questions about your symptoms, and convinced you to let me take you for an EKG." His face was now ashen, and he was gripping the edge of the table tightly. "In the end, it wasn't anything serious, just stress and indigestion. But I stayed with you through all the tests because I saw how scared you were. I explained the results to you and Mom in terms you could understand. We helped schedule follow-up appointments and set up a system to monitor your blood pressure at home." "I remember," he said softly. "This was the daughter you wish had never been born. The one who dropped everything to make sure you were okay. The one who used her professional knowledge to help keep you healthy and informed. I paused for his words to sink in. So you're right. Life would be much simpler without all this. Sandra was crying now too, and Bruce looked like he wanted to disappear completely. I've spent 28 years trying to earn the love you give Bruce so easily, I continued, my voice growing firmer with each word. I've sacrificed my time, my energy, my peace of mind for this family. I've rearranged my schedule around your needs, celebrated your achievements, and supported you through difficult times. You're right, my mother admitted through her tears. But you're right. You don't need me. And you know what? I don't need that anymore either. I walked to the kitchen counter where I'd left my purse and keys. When I turned around, everyone was looking at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Fear, panic, the sudden realization that maybe they'd gone too far. Margaret, let's talk about this rationally, my father said, his voice now filled with a pleading tone I had never heard from him before. We're past the talking stage, Dad. You said what you really think. You wished I'd never been born. Well, congratulations. From now on, you've got what you wanted. What do you mean by that? My mother asked, although I knew she already knew. I want to say I'm out. Out of these dinners where I'm criticized and compared to Bruce. Out of these phone calls where you barely hear what I'm saying. Out of being treated like a disappointment and an obligation. I slung my bag over my shoulder and grabbed my keys. I'm changing my phone number tomorrow. I'm not going to any more family gatherings. I'm not giving you any more birthday or Christmas presents. When you need medical help or to make health decisions, you'll have to do it yourself or ask Bruce for help. You can't be serious, Bruce said, getting up from his chair. I'm being completely serious. You wanted a life without me. Now you have it. My mother was sobbing now. Margaret, please. We said things we didn't mean. No, Mom. You said things you really wanted to say but never had the courage to say out loud. There's a difference. I headed towards the front door, but turned back to make one last statement. For 28 years, I tried to be the daughter you wanted. Starting tomorrow, you'll find out what life is like without the daughter you really had. With that, I left the house where I grew up for the last time. The first few days, after that dinner, were surreal. I sat in my apartment on Tuesday night, staring at my phone, waiting for someone to call. Part of me hoped my mom would reach out with an apology, or that Bruce would try to mediate. But my phone remained silent. On Wednesday morning, I kept my promise and changed my phone number. The woman at the phone store asked if I wanted to keep the number and just switch carriers, but I said I needed a completely new number. She looked at me curiously, but made the change, without asking any questions. That afternoon, I created new email addresses and changed my contact information at work, the bank, and my landlord. I was meticulous, making sure there was no way for my family to reach me through the usual channels. On Thursday, I realized they were trying to contact me. When I arrived at work for my night shift, the head nurse informed me that someone named Bruce had called looking for me. I asked her to tell anyone in my family that I was unavailable and that I couldn't take personal calls during work hours. On Friday, flowers arrived at my building. The delivery man buzzed my apartment intercom, and when I saw Patricia Henderson on the card through the window, I refused the delivery. I watched from my second-floor window as the confused delivery man carried the large flower arrangement back to his van. The hardest part wasn't missing my family. It was breaking the habits I had around them. Sunday morning arrived, and I automatically reached for my cell phone to make my weekly call, before remembering that chapter of my life was over. Instead, I made myself coffee and sat at my small counter, reading a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. For the first time in years, I had a whole weekend to myself. No family obligations, no guilt about not showing up for dinners or making phone calls, no anxiety about what I might say that might trigger criticism. It was strange, but also liberating. I dedicated myself to work with renewed energy. Without the emotional toll of weekly family interactions, I found myself more focused and present with my patients. I signed up for additional training sessions and began mentoring newer nurses. My supervisor noticed the change and commented on my improved attitude and increased engagement. 3 weeks after dinner, Bruce showed up at the hospital. I was leaving my shift when I saw him in the driveway, leaning against his SUV next to my car. My heart raced, but I forced myself to walk calmly toward him. "We need to talk," he said, when I got close enough to hear him. "No, we don't," I replied, unlocking my car door. "Maggie, please. Mommy and Daddy are a mess. They didn't mean what they said." I turned completely to him. "Bruce, they said they wished I had never been born. What part of that don't you understand? They were angry. People say stupid things when they're angry." "Seriously?" "Because I've been angry plenty of times, and I've never told anyone I wished they didn't exist." I opened my car door. "That's not something you say by accident. They regret it," he insisted. "Mommy cries every day. Daddy barely talks to anyone." "That's unfortunate for them," I said, getting into the car. "But it's not my problem anymore." He put his hand on my car door to stop me from closing it. "You're my sister. You can't just disappear from our lives." "Watch me," I said, moving his hand gently but firmly, and I closed the door. Through the window, I saw him standing there, looking lost and confused. When I left, I felt a pang in my heart for the relationship we might have had if our parents hadn't always positioned us as competitors instead of siblings. A month later, my landlord told me someone had asked about me. A woman matching my mother's description had come to the building twice, asking which unit I lived in. He refused to share this information, but it made me realize I needed to take additional steps to protect my privacy. I started parking in a different section of the hospital parking garage and varying my schedule whenever possible. I asked my closest work friends not to share any information about me with anyone who might be my family members. It seemed paranoid, but I knew my parents well enough to know they wouldn't give up easily. The hardest moment came 6 weeks after our last dinner. I was grocery shopping when I saw my mother in the produce section. She looked terrible, thin and tired, with deep circles under her eyes. For a moment, my resolve wavered. This was the woman who raised me, who bandaged my scraped knees and taught me to drive. But then I remembered her nodding when my father said they wished I had never been born. I remembered the years of criticism and comparisons, the feeling of being invisible and unappreciated within my own family. I turned my cart around and left the store without buying anything. 3 months later, I realized I was genuinely happier. The constant low-level anxiety I'd carried for years was gone. I no longer dreaded Sunday phone calls or Tuesday dinners. I no longer constantly doubted myself or tried to anticipate criticism. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, instead of trying to win approval that would never come. I started going out again, something I'd neglected while dealing with family stress. I joined a book club and a hiking group. I took a pottery class and discovered I had a talent for it. I was building a life based on my own interests and values, not on what might finally make my parents proud. The turning point came 4 months after I left their house. My friend Linda, who worked in the cardiac unit, mentioned that a man named Frank Henderson had been admitted with chest pains. She knew it was a common name and might not be related to me, but she thought I should know. My first instinct was to rush to the cardiac unit and check on him. My medical training kicked in, and I found myself mentally reviewing cardiac protocols and thinking about the questions I wanted to ask his doctors. But then I remembered he was no longer my responsibility. He had made it clear that my expertise and care were neither welcome nor necessary. I thanked Linda for the information and continued on with my shift. Later, I learned through hospital gossip that he was released after 2 days with a diagnosis of anxiety-related chest pain. The irony wasn't lost on me, as the stress of our family situation had literally caused his heart problems. Months after, leaving that family dinner, I was a different person. Not dramatically different, but more centered in a way I'd never been before. I moved to a new apartment in a neighborhood I loved, closer to downtown and within walking distance of several restaurants and shops. I adopted a rescue cat named Oliver, who seemed to understand that we were both starting over. My work became even more rewarding without the constant emotional drain of family stress. I was promoted to senior nurse and was being considered for a leadership position in the emergency room. My colleagues respected my skills and judgment, and I was invited to present at a regional conference on trauma protocols. I also started dating someone I really liked. Dr. James Murphy, an emergency room physician, invited me for coffee after we worked together on a particularly difficult case. He was kind, intelligent, and treated me as an equal partner in patient care. When he spoke about my work, it was with respect and admiration, not with disdain or suggestions for improvement. The relationship was still in its infancy, but he was teaching me what it's like to be valued for who I am, not criticized for who I am not. I also built a chosen family of friends who truly cared about me. Linda from the cardiac unit had become a close friend, and we had dinner together twice a week. Sarah from my hiking group invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family when she learned I would be alone. Marcus from my book club and I started a tradition of trying new restaurants together once a month. These relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not obligations or blood ties. When I achieved something at work, they celebrated with me. When I was having a hard day, they offered support without judgment. When I shared my thoughts and feelings, they listened without trying to fix or change me. The contrast with my biological family was stark. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly accepted. I'd heard updates about my family in the hospital hallways. My father had been treated for anxiety and started seeing a therapist. My mother was apparently asking mutual acquaintances if they'd seen me, always describing herself as concerned about my well-being. Bruce had been promoted to the management position he'd wanted. But according to someone who knew Sandra, the stress of the family situation had put a strain on their marriage. Part of me felt sad for their struggles, but I reminded myself that these were the consequences of their choices. They had created this situation with their words and actions. They were dealing with the consequences of treating one child as valuable and the other as disposable. The true test of my resolve came when I received an unexpected visitor at work. It was a Tuesday evening in late fall when the security guard at the emergency room entrance called me to let me know someone was asking for me. When I arrived at the CR reception desk, I found Sandra there, looking nervous and uncomfortable. "Margaret, I know you don't want to see any of us," she began, "but I've come for something important." I thought about walking away, but something in her expression made me stop. "What is it?" "Your mother is in the hospital. At Valley General, not here. She had a stroke yesterday." The words hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened, despite the months of separation and anger, my mother was still my mother. My medical training immediately kicked in, and I began asking questions about her condition, her treatment, her prognosis. "She's stable," Sandra said quickly. "But it was significant. She's having difficulty speaking and moving on her left side. Her father is with her, but he's not coping well. He keeps asking the nurses questions they can't answer and is getting frustrated because he doesn't understand medical terminology." I could picture it perfectly. My father, scared and confused, trying to navigate a healthcare system he didn't understand, struggling to advocate for his wife without the medical knowledge to ask the right questions or interpret the answers he received. "Bruce is trying to help," Sandra continued, "but he also knows nothing about medical issues. We wonder how he would know what questions to ask, what doctors really mean when they use technical terms." It was a skillful appeal, and Sandra was smart enough to frame it in terms of my expertise, not my familial obligation. She was acknowledging that I possessed the knowledge and skills they needed, rather than simply demanding I go there because I was related. "I'm sorry this happened," he said carefully. "But I'm not part of your family anymore, remember?" Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "Margaret, I know what they said was horrible. I know they hurt you in ways that can't be easily forgiven. But this is different. This is about ensuring your mother receives the best care and support during her recovery." She was right, and she knew it. This wasn't about family loyalty, forgiveness, or reconciliation. It was about my professional knowledge and my personal integrity. Could I stand by and let my mother receive substandard care because I was angry with my parents? What exactly are you asking me to do? I asked finally. Could you just talk to her doctors, not as her daughter, but as a healthcare professional? Help us understand what we're dealing with and what questions we should be asking. It was a reasonable request, phrased in a way that respected my boundaries while acknowledging my expertise. Sandra had clearly thought this through. I stood there for a long moment, weighing my options. I could maintain my boundaries and refuse to get involved. I could compromise those boundaries and risk being drawn back into the family drama. Or I could find a middle ground that respected both my professional ethics and my personal boundaries. I'll make a call, he finally said, to her attending physician. I'll ask for a clinical summary of her condition and treatment plan. Then I'll explain it to you and your family in terms you can understand. That's all. One call, one explanation, and then I'll be out of here. Sandra nodded eagerly. That would help so much. Thank you. But I want to make one thing clear, I continued. This doesn't change anything between me and my parents. I'm doing this because it's medically right, not because I'm ready to reconcile or forgive. I understand, she said softly. I made the connection that night after my shift ended. Dr. Rodriguez, my mother's neurologist, was professional and thorough in explaining her condition. She had suffered a moderate ischemic stroke, affecting the left side of her brain. Her speech and motor functions were impaired, but there was reason to be optimistic about recovery with proper rehabilitation. The next morning, I met Sandra at a coffee shop near the hospital and spent an hour explaining everything Dr. Rodriguez had told me. I translated medical terminology into simple Portuguese, outlined the expected recovery timeline, and provided a list of questions they should ask about rehabilitation options and follow-up care. Are you going to see her? Sandra asked as we were getting ready to leave. No, I replied firmly. I did what I could do professionally. The rest is up to you and the medical team. Sandra looked like she wanted to argue, but she simply nodded and thanked me for my help. 3 days later, I received a handwritten letter at my apartment. The envelope was in my mother's shaky handwriting, clearly written with her non-dominant hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few words on it. Thank you for helping, even when we didn't deserve it. I'm sorry for everything. I love you. I read the letter 3 times, and then put it in a drawer. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Words on paper couldn't erase 28 years of feeling second best. An apology written from a hospital bed couldn't erase the damage of being told I should never have been born, but it was something. For the first time since that horrible dinner, one of my parents acknowledged they were wrong, and that I had been wronged. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever received from them before. I didn't reply to the letter, but I didn't throw it away either. I left it in the drawer, a small symbol of possibility in a relationship that might someday be repaired, though it would never be the same. What I learned over those 9 months was that I didn't need their approval to be valuable. I didn't need their love to be worthy of love. I had built a life filled with meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the kind of respect I'd always sought in my family. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to walk away, and sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose for yourself. I chose to surround myself with people who saw my worth, who celebrated my achievements, and who treated me with the kindness and respect every person deserves. For the first time in my life, I was enough, exactly as I was. And that realization was worth more than any apology or attempt at reconciliation could ever achieve. I walked away from a family that made me feel small and worthless, and I entered a life where I could finally see my own worth clearly. This wasn't just healing. It was transformation. This wasn't just survival. It was victory. And as I sat in my new apartment that night, with Oliver purring on my lap and a text from James asking how my day was, I knew I had made the right choice. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize you never really had it. And sometimes you have to walk away from people who don't value you to find those who do. I craved my parents' love for 28 years. Now, I understand that their love, conditional and critical as it was never what I truly needed. what I really needed was to love and value myself enough to walk away from people who couldn't see my worth. This lesson was painful to learn, but it was the most important thing I've ever discovered, and no one could ever take that knowledge away from me. Have you ever had to walk away from family members who didn't treat you with respect? How did you find the courage to put yourself first? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more real stories about setting boundaries and finding your self-worth. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they deserve better than conditional love. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that you are valuable just as you are. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who see us the least clearly. But that doesn't mean we have to accept their version of who we are. I hope that wherever you are on your own journey, you find the strength to surround yourself with people who celebrate you, rather than constantly trying to change you. You deserve nothing less than genuine love and respect. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.